What if I told you that your character's favorite color is ruining your entire story? You might think I'm exaggerating, but after being immersed in the craft of fantasy writing for more than 2 decades now, I've learned that the devil truly is in the details, especially when it comes to descriptions. In this video, I'll guide you through the 9 most critical description pitfalls that threaten your story's potential and show you how to transform your prose from mundane to magical. Let's start by exploring the untapped power of the senses that so many writers keep neglecting. Picture this: you're crafting an epic battle scene in your fantasy novel. The clash of swords, the glint of armor in the sunlight, the determined expressions on the warriors' faces. It's all there in vivid detail. But wait, there is something missing. Your readers aren't quite immersed as you'd hoped. But why? Well, because you fall into the trap of neglecting all the other senses. You see, when it comes to descriptions, most fantasy writers are like artists working with only one color. They paint beautiful visual pictures, but forget that our world, and by extension our fictional worlds, are experienced through all 5 senses. The most unforgettable worlds are the ones we can taste, touch, and smell. Think about it. What's more evocative here? Describing a bustling marketplace as crowded and colorful, or letting your readers experience the sharp scent of spices, the clamor of haggling voices, and the rough texture of burlap sacks filled with grain? But here's where it gets really interesting. Did you know that smell is the sense most closely linked to memory and emotion? It's true. Our brains are wired in a way that connects smell directly to the areas responsible for memory and feeling. So when you describe a smell in your story, you're not just adding detail, you're tapping directly into your reader's emotional core. Here's a quick exercise. Close your eyes and think of your childhood home. What do you remember first? For many, it's not the color of the walls or the shape of the rooms. It's the smell of mom's cooking, the feel of that old worn carpet under bare feet, or the distant sound of a creaky swing in the backyard. That's the power of sensory description. It doesn't just show your reader the world, it transports them there. But I know what you're thinking. How do I incorporate all these senses without turning my novel into a sensory overload? Don't worry, I've got you covered, because this is the second mistake we want to avoid. Picture this: you're enjoying a delicious meal. The aroma is enticing, the flavors dance on your tongue, the textures are perfectly balanced. But then, imagine if someone cranked up every sensation tenfold. Suddenly, the smell is overpowering, the taste is so intense it burns, and the texture feels like it's assaulting your mouth. Not so enjoyable anymore, is it? This is exactly what happens when writers fall into the sensory overload trap. In their eagerness to create a vivid world, they bombard readers with an endless barrage of sensory details. It's like trying to listen to every instrument in an orchestra playing at full volume simultaneously. You end up hearing nothing but voice. Consider the description of a tavern scene where the author mentions the smoky air, the smell of ale and sweat, the rough wooden tables, the glint of candlelight on tankards, the taste of hearty stew, the sound of laughter and clinking coins, the feel of sticky floors underfoot, and more. By the time you'd finish reading this, it would feel like you needed a nap just to recover. So how do we strike the right balance then? The key lies in selectivity and relevance. Instead of trying to engage all 5 senses in every scene, focus on the details that matter most to your point of view character at that moment. What would they notice first based on who they are? And what sensory input is most important to the scene or the plot? Remember, your goal isn't to recreate reality in exhaustive detail. It's to give your readers just enough sensory information to spark their imagination and let them fill in the rest. But there is another aspect to this that many writers overlook. Not just about what sensory details to include, but how you present them. And this is where we stumble into our next pitfall, one that can make even carefully chosen sensory details fall flat. Let me ask you this. Have you ever read a fantasy novel where the descriptions, while beautifully written, felt somehow disconnected? As if they could have been lifted from any story and dropped into yours. That's because the author fell into the trap of neglecting their character's unique lens. You see, it's not enough to simply describe what's happening in a scene. The magic happens when you filter those descriptions through your character's unique perspective. Imagine 2 characters walking into the same throne room. One is a seasoned warrior, battle-hardened and wary. The other is a wide-eyed farm boy on his first adventure. Do you think they'd notice the same things? Of course not. The warrior might immediately assess the room for potential threats, noting the position of guards, possible escape routes, and any weapons on display. The farm boy, on the other hand, might be overwhelmed by the opulence, marveling at the intricate tapestries, the gleaming marble floors, or the imposing throne itself. But it goes deeper than just what they notice. It's about how they interpret what they see, hear, smell, and feel based on their unique experiences and personalities. Consider this: a character who grew up in a bustling port city might describe the smell of the sea as comforting and familiar. But for a character from a landlocked kingdom, that same scent might be exotic, even a bit unsettling. By filtering your descriptions through your character's lens, you're not just showing your readers the world, you're inviting them to experience it as your character does. This is how you create that deep, visceral connection between your readers and your characters. But be warned, there is a fine line between giving your characters a unique perspective and falling into our next trap. It's a mistake so common, yet so subtle, that even experienced writers sometimes don't realize they are making it. Have you ever found yourself writing about emerald eyes, raven hair, or a lone wolf character? If so, you might have stumbled into the realm of cliché descriptors, a trap so common in fantasy writing that it's almost become a rite of passage. But here's the thing: while these familiar phrases might seem like a shortcut to vivid descriptions, they are actually doing more harm than good to your story. Let me explain why. Imagine you're at a grand feast in a fantasy world. The table is laden with exotic dishes from far-off lands. You're excited to taste new flavors, experience culinary wonders you've never encountered before. But as you start to eat, you realize every dish tastes exactly like chicken. Disappointing, right? That's what cliché descriptors do to your readers. They promise a unique, immersive experience, but deliver the same old flavors they've tasted 100 times before. Let's take a closer look at some of these overused phrases. We've all read about characters with eyes like sapphires or hair like spun gold. But what do these really tell us about the character? Do they paint a unique picture? Or are they just placeholder images our brains fill in automatically? Consider the grizzled old warrior or the wise old wizard. These archetypes are so common that as soon as a reader encounters them, they think they know everything about that character. But is that really what you want? To have your readers assume they know your characters before they've even started their journey? And the danger of clichés goes even beyond just being unoriginal. They can actually break the immersion you're working so hard to create. When readers encounter a cliché, it reminds them that they are reading a story, the exact opposite of what we want as writers. So how do we avoid this trap? Well, the key lies in observation and specificity. Instead of reaching for the first description that comes to mind, take a moment to really see your character or setting. What makes them unique? What unexpected details might catch a viewer's eye? For example, instead of describing a character's eyes as emerald green, you might notice that they're the pale green of sea glass with flecks of gold near the pupil. Instead of a grizzled warrior, you might have a fighter whose left hand continuously taps out battle rhythms on his thigh, a habit picked up from years of drumming war signals. But here's where it gets tricky. In our effort to avoid clichés, it's easy to swing too far in the opposite direction. And that leads us into our next pitfall, one that can turn your unique descriptions into unintentional comedy. Have you ever met someone who tried so hard to be unique that they ended up being ridiculous? Well, the same thing can happen to your characters if you're not careful. Picture this: you're reading a fantasy novel and you encounter a character with mismatched eyes. One sapphire blue, one molten gold. Interesting, right? Well, then you'll learn they also have a streak of silver in their otherwise raven black hair, a scar shaped like a lightning bolt on their cheek, and oh, they can talk to animals, but only on Tuesdays. Suddenly, your intriguing character has become a circus act. This is the danger of overcompensating when trying to avoid clichés. In our eagerness to make characters stand out, we can end up piling on so many unique traits that they become unbelievable, or worse, laughable. But why is this such a common pitfall? Well, it often stems from a good place: the desire to create memorable, distinctive characters. We want our heroes and villains to stick in the reader's mind, to be instantly recognizable. And in a genre like fantasy, where the impossible is possible, it's tempting to go overboard. Let's take a closer look at some examples. Maybe you've created a warrior princess with flowing purple hair, eyes that change color with her mood, and the ability to control fire. Each of these traits on its own might be interesting, but together, they start to feel like too much. The problem with quirk overkill goes beyond just making your characters hard to take seriously though. It can actually detract from your story by distracting readers from what really matters, your character's personality, motivations, and growth. So how do we strike the right balance here? How do we create unique, memorable characters without turning them into a collection of quirks? The key lies in understanding that true uniqueness comes from within. It's not about how many unusual physical traits or magical abilities you can give a character. It's about their personality, their way of thinking, their fears and desires. When crafting your characters, focus on one or two standout traits that truly matter to their story arc or personality. Maybe your warrior has a distinctive scar that affects how others perceive them, or perhaps your mage has an unusual eye color that hints at their magical lineage. The key is to choose traits that serve a purpose in your story, not just to make your characters different. Now, if you found anything useful in the video so far, please consider giving it a like to help me grow the channel. Thank you. Moving on, even when we understand the concept of using quirks the right way, there's another descriptive pitfall waiting to trip us up. Have you ever read a passage in a fantasy novel that made you feel like you needed a dictionary and a translator just to understand what was happening? If so, you've likely encountered the dreaded purple prose pitfall. Picture this, you're reading about a simple sunset, but instead of the sun set behind the mountains, you get something like, the celestial orb of effulgent radiance descended in a blaze of chromatic glory, its repleasant hues cascading across the firmament as it nestled into the violet-hued embrace of the distant craggy sentinels. Exhausting, isn't it? This is the essence of purple prose. Writing that's so ornate, so flowery, that it obscures rather than enhances the story. It's like covering a beautiful painting with so many layers of glitter that you can no longer see the original image. But why do writers fall into this trap? Often this too comes from a well-intentioned place. We want our writing to be beautiful, to evoke vivid images in our readers' minds. We want to show off our expansive vocabulary and our ability to craft complex sentences. The problem is, when we get too caught up in the beauty of our own words, we lose sight of what's truly important, the story itself. Let's look at some common signs of purple prose. Do you find yourself reaching for the thesaurus to replace simple words with more sophisticated ones? Are your sentences so long and convoluted that you lose track of where they began? Do you use 3 adjectives where 1 would suffice? These are all red flags that you might be veering into purple prose territory. But here's the thing, there's a fine line between vivid, evocative writing and overwrought purple prose. Some of the most beautiful passages in literature are quite elaborate. But how do we know when we've crossed the line? The key lies in understanding the purpose of your descriptions. Every word, every phrase should serve the story. If your elaborate description draws readers deeper into the world or reveals something important about a character, it might just be justified. But if it's there just to show off your vocabulary or to pad your word count, it's likely purple prose. So how do you avoid this pitfall while still creating rich immersive descriptions? Well, that's where things get interesting, because the solution to purple prose isn't always what you might expect. In fact, it leads us right into our next challenge, one that might seem contradictory at first, but it's crucial for creating truly engaging fantasy worlds. Imagine you're exploring a vast fantasy world through a magical telescope. At first, you zoomed in so close that you can count the scales on a dragon's snout. But then, suddenly, you're pulled back so far that entire kingdoms become mere specks on a map. Disorienting, right? That's what inconsistent description depth does to your readers. Let's paint a picture here. You spend 3 paragraphs describing the intricate carvings on a palace door, detailing every whirl and figure. But when your protagonist steps inside, you breeze past the throne room with a single sentence. Your readers, primed for detail, suddenly feel like they're skimming rather than immersing. Why does this happen? Often, it's because we get excited about certain elements of our story and lavish attention on them, while other parts feel more like necessary transitions. Or maybe we're trying to pick up the pace in some sections, forgetting that abrupt changes in descriptive depth can be just as jarring as changes in pacing. But here's the tricky part. Consistent doesn't mean uniform. You don't want every element of your story described in exactly the same level of detail. That would be monotonous. The key is to create a sense of balance and purpose in your varying levels of description. Think of your story like a painting. Some elements are in the foreground, demanding more detail and attention. Others form the background, requiring broader stroke. The most important aspects of a scene, be it a crucial character interaction, a pivotal moment in the plot, or an element central to your world building, these deserve more descriptive focus. Less critical elements can be sketched more lightly, allowing the reader's imagination to fill in the gaps. So how do we achieve this balance? How do we know when to zoom in and when to pull back? Well, that's where things get really interesting, because the solution to this problem ties directly into one of the most fundamental principles of storytelling: the idea that your world should be as alive and dynamic as your characters. Imagine a story set in a grand magical city. You've detailed its floating towers, its enchanted marketplaces, its complex political systems. But as your hero's actions shake the foundations of society, the city remains oddly unaffected. The same shopkeepers hawk the same wares, the same guards patrol the same routes, regardless of the earth-shattering events unfolding around them. This is the essence of the static world syndrome, a common pitfall where writers treat their carefully crafted worlds as mere scenery rather than an integral dynamic part of the story. The problem with this approach is that it creates a disconnect between your characters and the world. It makes your setting feel artificial, like a movie set, rather than a real place. But why does this happen? Often it's because we become so focused on our main plot and characters that we forget to consider how they interact with and change the world around them. Or perhaps we're afraid of complicating our carefully planned plot by allowing the world to react and evolve. The question then is, how do we avoid this syndrome? How do we breathe life into our fantasy worlds and make them active participants in our stories? The key lies in understanding that your world should be as dynamic as your characters. That is easy. But what does this mean? Well, it means it should react, adapt, and change as your story progresses. It means to consider the ripple effects of your plot events on the wider world. For instance, if your hero's actions lead to a change in government, how does this affect the everyday lives of citizens? If a major magical discovery is made, how does this alter the economy, social structures, or even the environment of your world? To create this dynamism, try these techniques. First, we have cause and effect. For every major event in your plot, list out potential consequences on different scales, from individual characters to entire nations. Then we have a living background. Populate your world with minor characters who evolve over time, reflecting the changes in the world around them. Then there's also evolving settings. Revisit locations throughout your story, showing how they've changed due to plot events or the passage of time. And consider adaptive systems. Design your world systems like magic, technology, politics to be flexible, capable of changing in response to new discoveries or challenges. But here's where it gets tricky, because there's a fine line between a dynamic world and one that's chaotic or inconsistent. The changes in your world should feel organic and logical, not random or convenient to the plot. It's about striking a balance between a world that evolves and one that remains recognizable and coherent to your readers. Now, we've talked about creating dynamic evolving worlds just now, but there's one final pitfall that can turn even the most vibrant fantasy realm into a confusing mess. It's a mistake so subtle you might not even realize you're making it, but its impact can be devastating to your story. Let me ask you this. Have you ever read a story where you struggled to picture what was happening, where the world felt somehow intangible? That's what happens when writers lose touch with concrete details. Imagine you're reading about an epic battle. The author tells you about the clash of good and evil, the struggle between light and darkness. They go on in a poetic way about the bravery of the heroes and the menace of the villains. But what does the battlefield look like? What do the weapons sound like as they clash? Can you smell the sweat and fear? This is the danger of getting lost in abstract concepts and forgetting to ground your story in tangible sensory details. But why does this happen? Often it's because we get so caught up in the big ideas of our story, the themes, the character arcs, the intricate plot twists, that we forget to connect them to the physical reality of our world. We might spend paragraphs on a character's inner turmoil, but forget to mention the rain soaking through their clothes. Or perhaps we're trying so hard to be profound that we shy away from the mundane details that actually make a world feel real. It's the tangible details, the rough texture of a dragon's scales, the acrid smell of a failed potion, the sound of a spell fizzling out, that makes your world come alive. These concrete elements are the bridge between your reader's reality and the fantastic realm you've created. By grounding your descriptions in concrete details, you're not just avoiding a common pitfall, you're unlocking the full potential of your fantasy world. But in order to describe anything, you first need to imagine it. And the foundation for that is proper world building. So to avoid starting off on the wrong foot, check out this video here and follow along through the entire world building fundamentals series.